Okay, so I welcomed you, and I want to introduce myself. I am Lynn Sutton. I am Dean of the Z. Smith Reynolds Library, and I will be your moderator today. And my first task is to introduce our distinguished panelists. I will start with Rogan Kersh, who is in the middle. Most of you know who Rogan is. Rogan received his bachelor's degree from Wake Forest in 1986, and he returned to us as Provost and Professor of Political Science in July 2012. He came to us from NYU's School of Public Service, and he was Professor of Policy and Associate Dean there. He has published 3 books, many, many journal articles, many, many teaching awards. He achieved his PhD at Yale. 1996. And we're glad that
paid for this system. I think it's doing this.
We are glad that he is back with us. To your right is on the end Andy Chan. Andy is our Vice President of Personal and Career Development here at Wake Forest. He went to Stanford for his bachelor's degree and his master's, his MBA. He is the first career services professional to receive a vice president position in higher education. So we congratulate him on that. He is personally, I think, leading the transformation of traditional career services to a completely new paradigm, and I suspect that we will hear a little bit about that in the conversation. Okay. Let's just think of it as robins tweeting around and landing on the wires. Andy has been interviewed by many media outlets, the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, Inside Higher Ed, the Chronicle of Higher Education, New York Times Magazine, and maybe what makes him most famous, he has given a TED Talk. And finally, to your left is Mike Riley, who is the editor of the Chronicle of Higher Education. We are very fortunate that Mike is also a Wake Forest grad. So he was very happy to come back to his alma mater. He got his bachelor's in English here in 1981, and then went on to Harvard for an MPA at the Kennedy School of Government. Just before the Chronicle, he was at Bloomberg Government. Before that, he was with Congressional Quarterly, and he actually started as a journalist here in North Carolina at the Dispatch in Lexington, and then Roanoke Times, and then a 10-year stint as bureau chief for Time magazine. So I think you can see that we have panelists who all have experience here at Wake Forest, but also have a broader view, and I hope they will draw on both of those aspects in our conversation. So my job is to be a bit of a provocateur, if you will, to provoke discussion on big topics in higher education, the most difficult questions facing all of us. And when I say higher education, I do mean broader than just Wake Forest. Certainly our experience is largely here on this campus, but we are a liberal arts college and a collegiate university, and there are many other different kinds of institutions of higher learning in our country. Some of the changes that we're going to be talking about may be affecting them more than us right now, or may be affecting us more than them right now. But it's all part of the thing that we're going to look at. I will say in advance that not all of the questions that I pose are my own personal beliefs. I am taking this opportunity to play a little bit of bad cop and inviting the panelists to rescue us and play a little bit of good cop with their solutions. I think it's important that we raise some worst case scenarios and look at them, because that way we can prepare ourselves to invent some alternative futures for us that are maybe a little rosier than the bleak picture that I'm going to be painting at the beginning. Some of you might wonder why I'm standing here. Why is the library leading this discussion? And it's because we in libraries have actually gone through a very disruptive period. Libraries, maybe like journalism, have seen very, very substantial changes in the last couple of decades, at least since the invention of the internet. The very stuff of our existence, the print books and journals, are just sort of evaporating away. And we have to face that. And I think those same changes are what are facing higher education now. So we as libraries have some experience to share. Back in the old days, libraries were really more about keeping books safe from people. And so people decided, all right, then we'll just invent ebooks so we don't have to come to the library to get them. And then we in libraries discovered maybe we're really more about helping people with the books than we are just about the books themselves. So now libraries who have adjusted to this disruption, who have made the transition, are very happy and successful and thriving and helping people use information in a digital world. So that's some of the things that we will talk about in the parallels that we'll draw. My premise is that we at Wake Forest are very, very good at what we do. Our model of premier residential face-to-face education, equipped with a laptop program, has gotten us to the pinnacle. We're at number 23 in the rankings for national universities, higher than we've ever been before. But my greatest fear, my personal greatest fear, is that we at Wake Forest will go the way of the innovator's dilemma. I don't know, some of you may have heard of that, but it's a concept by Harvard Business School professor Clayton Christensen, and the subtitle was, "When New Technologies Cause Great Companies to Fail." So big successful companies like Kodak and Blockbuster and Xerox were all at the pinnacle of their game, doing what they did to get to the top, kept doing what they were doing to get to the top. And they forgot to look around and see actually the world is changing all around them. And eventually they were made irrelevant by not paying attention. So notably, Clay's latest book is called Disrupting Class, How Disruptive Innovation Will Change the Way the World Learns. And so the message is it's coming to higher education as well. Another disturbing way we could look at our future, you know, that's all I do, I just think of disturbing ways to look at our future, is the allegory of the boiling frog, if you know that funny story. And the premise is that if a frog is dropped into boiling water, he's really smart, he hops back out. But if he starts out in lukewarm water, and then gradually the temperature is turned up higher and higher and higher, he doesn't perceive the danger, and eventually he boils to death. So what we don't want to do, and I hope at the end of this session, we will not be in a place where higher education and Wake Forest are the boiling frog. So this is just a visual representation of a comment that President John Hennessy made of Stanford University in February 2012, talking about the changes that were coming to higher education. And he said, there's a tsunami coming. And to institutions of higher education whose model has really not changed much since medieval times, I Googled medieval university and that's what I got on the left. We haven't really changed that much, 900 years. This is startling news, but this is what we're going to talk about today. So that's the framing of the question. I will now explain the format. I will ask the panelists up to 9 questions, time permitting, and each panelist will be the lead on 3 questions on topics that they chose. We all agreed on 9 broad topics and ahead of time, but they do not know the specific question that I'm going to ask them. After the lead person gives the initial response, about 4 to 5 minutes, then the other 2 are invited to add brief comments as desired. At the end of the 9 questions, or at 3:30, and Mary Beth be my timekeeper, at 3:30, we will go to audience Q&A because we promised we would spend some time doing that. You are also invited to tweet your questions to #BigDisrupt. We have 2 tweeters down here, and if we don't have live questions from people wanting to stand up, we will go to the Twitter feed and ask questions from there. Everybody good so far? Okay. So the first question. Question number 1 goes to Mike. The first question is about MOOCs, Massive Open Online Courses and Online Education. And just let me check in with the audience here. How many people would appreciate a mini explanation of what a MOOC is, or do we all understand what MOOCs are? Very few in the back. I'll be very, very brief. MOOCs are massive open online courses. They are free. They are offered by distinguished professors at distinguished institutions around the country who offer their content open online. It started about 5 years ago. About 2 years ago, Stanford University offered some of its courses. It got hundreds of thousands of people who took these courses online. Since then, there have been at least 3 startup enterprises that have gone for MOOCs, and that's where I'll start my question. We are ranked number 23. 20 of the 22 institutions ranked higher than we are active in one of the MOOC providers, mostly Coursera or edX. And Harvard and MIT spent $30 million. $30 million they invested in the edX enterprise. It has been said that MOOCs reflect a societal imperative to bring quality education at low cost to a global audience. Actually, I said that, but I said it at a conference, so it counts. So, Mike, here's the question. All that was prologue. The question is, look ahead 10 years. Imagine yourself in the year 2024, and tell us what role either MOOCs in particular or online education in general played in higher education in that 10-year time period.
All right, I'll get my, can you hear me? Yes?
Yes.
I'll get my crystal ball out and give that a shot. I think in academe, sort of for so many centuries, the driving force was to publish or perish for a professor, for a researcher, right? I think now the leitmotif is adapt or perish for higher education. And I think what we're seeing with MOOCs is absolutely fascinating. 2 years ago, most people in this country couldn't have told you what a MOOC was. It is a hugely disruptive force. Technology usually is. 20-odd years ago, as a journalist, I heard about this thing called the internet. You guys may have heard about that. And I thought, holy crap, if I can say that here, that is going to significantly change how I do my job, how the world consumes news, et cetera. I better learn about it. So I started learning about it 20 years ago. So I feel sort of like a grandfather on the internet. MOOCs is the first time that higher ed, outside of libraries, really has had to face a technological disruptor. And I think it's more emblematic and symbolic of the changes that are going to be coming. I think what a MOOC does, on one hand, are some great things. It reduces the marginal cost of teaching a new student to just about zero, right? That's pretty good. Rogan can tell you about rising costs at universities. They just keep going up. Here's a way in which they're not. You can have a global reach. If a person has an internet connection, you can have that global reach. You can actually be a very effective teacher, argue with MOOCs. But what happened about 2 years ago was this great sense that MOOCs are going to undercut everything the faculty does. It's going to change drastically the nature of higher education and the college classroom, and it's going to destroy what we have spent 900 plus years building, which is this great institution for the creation and the garnering and the use of knowledge. Well, fast forward 10 years from now, my prediction would be that this initial hysteria and wing flapping has died down. There are places that have learned in various ways to use this new technology in a very smart way. In fact, I would argue the ones that are able to use it in a smart way are the ones who are going to adapt and survive. I think those who don't figure it out are going to be the ones that perish in terms of institutions and in terms of professors. The smart professors, I think, are going to understand how using technology is a great way for conveying information that your class needs to know. And instead of getting up and lecturing with your yellow note cards, you're going to be able to have students on their own time, at their own pace, learn what they need to learn. You're going to know what they've learned. They're going to know that you know what they've learned, and you're going to know that they know that you know what they've learned. So there's great accountability across that system. And then you spend the classroom time when you have face-to-face, because I think that's where truly education is most effective, face-to-face, you're going to be able to spend the time really diving deeply on things that matter. So I think the institutions that are out there trying Coursera and edX and all these other sorts of things are in the vanguard. what's going to happen to some of them, unfortunately, and this is totally politically incorrect, so I apologize in advance for it, but the saying goes, in technologists have adapted this, that essentially the pioneers get the arrows, the settlers get the land. So I'm not sure that necessarily being on the vanguard is a smart place to be, on the tip of that spear. I think those folks who take a little bit of time and think about how you integrate MOOCs into the classroom, how you integrate internet technology, how you integrate learning at your own pace, are going to be the winners in this. And ultimately, the students are going to be the winners. So I think you're going to see a multiplicity of things. You're going to have classes with Sebastian Thrun type folks, the Stanford professor who started the first MOOC and set this all ablaze. He's going to have a classroom, a virtual classroom of 160, 180, 200,000 people across the globe learning about artificial intelligence or computer science. You're also going to have a professor here at Wake Forest who's going to be able to integrate that technology into the classroom and do what I heard a professor from Stanford saying the other day. A professor there has figured out how to take a very complicated statistics course that usually goes for 15 weeks, is very hard to get the students to learn, let alone pass the course material, has reduced it to 8 weeks, and the students are coming out of that saying, I learned better, I learned faster, this is the best experience I've had in class. Who's going to become the master of that technology, and who is going to understand that the internet is a tool to be used? It doesn't replace teaching, but it can be introduced and molded into the pedagogy that professors use and that students use to learn by in a very effective manner. So I would say we're going to see a multiplicity of things in 10 years, and those institutions that figure out how to use the technology best and are going to be the survivors.
Okay. Andy or Rogan?
So one of the trickiest parts about that question is that we're asking about people who today are 8 years old. And interestingly, I looked up last night, there's a 2009 study by the Department of Education that says that kids who today are in K through 12 are actually taking online courses, and their learning quality is actually as good or better than what they were getting one-on-one in the classroom. So if actually those students today in K through 12 are learning online and actually getting a good experience, by the time that they are 18, they're going to actually expect something similar. So whether or not we like it, the reality is that I think that our constituency base who we serve, which are our students, are going to be expecting it. So that's actually a big question for us to ask is, for those of you who have 8-year-olds, 9-year-olds, 10-year-olds, and they're actually on their iPads at the age of 0, learning how to out-app you at 1, they're expecting something totally different when they get in the classroom. And if we don't have it, I think they're going to say, as simple as doing a visit, maybe it's a virtual visit to campus, what do you have in terms of how you teach me? Because this is the way that I learn stuff, and if you don't have it the way they like it, I think the interesting part about education is that it's an incredibly fragmented market. And so because it's so fragmented, it gives people incredible numbers of choices. And what we're seeing now is that those choices are actually proliferating. And they're proliferating in terms of for-profit ventures. They're proliferating in terms of nonprofits that have for-profit looks to them. They're all technology new universities. So I think that's the one thing that's very interesting, is that with this fragmentation, it's most important that our university in particular get very clear as to what's our distinctive thing that we offer that we sense is so true to our mission and our value proposition of what we teach in the overall residential experience that we just nail it. And maybe it has a technology component or maybe it doesn't, but it's going to have some kind of technology component that's very relevant to the way that students 10 years from now expect to learn. And especially if the price tag is at the same place, or let's say plus $25,000 more, $100,000 a year in the year 2025, as much as a Mercedes-Benz and a nice one, each year, what do you think that the family's going to expect us to deliver? And if they say, well, we actually deliver school like the way you had it up on that chart back to the medieval ages, I think they're going to go, there's got to be a better place than that. So I agree that I think that there's going to be a lot of challenges in terms of thinking that through. The other piece of it that gets difficult about it is that technology is super expensive. It's expensive to start. It's expensive to train people to use it. The faculty, the staff, is expensive to maintain and expensive to upgrade and invest in. So that puts a lot more pressure actually on all institutions, because what happens is that you're actually thinking, who are the kinds of institutions who can afford to do it? The rich ones. The ones that have huge endowments, that have actually alumni that give millions of dollars, that actually, Bill Gates didn't even go there, but he wants to give money to it because it's such a prestigious school. That's tricky. Like, that's a tricky thing. I mean, just as we talk about in society, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, we're going to see that in universities. And I would have to say that whether you recognize it or not, we're not one of the rich universities. We look like it on the outside. If you actually ask parents when they come and visit and families when they come and visit, they go, this place is rich. But when you actually look at how much money we have to spend on things like upgrading technology, faculty training, extra stuff just because they're cool things to do, we don't have a whole lot. So that's a real interesting challenge we have, but I can tell you that the majority, probably like 95% of the universities in the country, have that same exact problem. So that's why when I think about this thing about the tsunami, it's happening, and it's like we don't even know it. So I was going to actually mention one other last thing, which is, I love the title of this, called The Big Disrupt. Have any of you been in an earthquake before? Raise your hand. Okay. So when you're in an earthquake, what happens actually is, like, in the first 15 seconds, you're not even sure there's an earthquake going on, right? You're not even sure you feel anything. And all of a sudden you start to feel it. And if you're lucky, it ends. But if you've been in one, so was anyone in that big one back in Oakland in 1989, San Francisco area, right? You're sort of thinking to yourself, this is not ending. This is getting worse. And actually, you're starting to see things shake. I was actually in a building where across the way, people were actually building another building, and the guys were holding on like it was an erector set on the poles that were flying like this. It was crazy. I actually think that's where we are right now in higher ed, is that we're in the first 15 seconds of this earthquake, and it's still coming. And that's like a tsunami. It's like it happens all across the ocean, an earthquake happens, and all of a sudden, like days later, this huge tidal wave happens. I think that's what this is happening here. And so we have to actually be thinking, we may barely even be feeling it here, but we have to be trying to be prepared for when it comes.
Okay, Rogan, they left you 2 minutes.
Lots of detail. I'll simply go to two things that worry me about this world. One is that many of the innovations in technology and otherwise, often developed in universities, by the time you get 10 years out, as we're looking now, no longer are controlled by or even all that, organized by universities. They wind up usually in the for-profit world, and I think that's going to happen in MOOCs. There's already elaborate corporate developed public MOOCs that are overtaking, in some cases, the kinds of things often offered by university professors. So when it's a MOOC sponsored by Mobil about the joys of fossil fuels, and that's what these current 8-year-olds are finding online because we haven't figured out how to curate it particularly well, that worries me a great deal. We assume we have the choice of whether to provide these or not, and we can be either forward-looking or skeptical. Other people are going to provide these for us, and we've got to work very hard to figure out how we can maintain some control. Technology after technology, I think that's been the case in the university land. Another thing that worries me, although it also intrigues me, so this is a lot of the comments you're going to hear from us, I think, will be, I hope, best of times, worst of times combination, is the extraordinary amount of data about students and how they learn generated by MOOCs. Faculty here and elsewhere who are in the education field and love to figure out how we can assess what it is students are learning are astonished at the level of data available on who's taking this class, how long are they looking at things online, how much are they absorbing this lesson. It's stunning. Harvard and MIT have just created a real-time, de-identified, enormous database of course registrants. They've got over 1 million course registrants in their edX venture. And any researcher who wants to can now download it and do any kind of manipulation of trying to understand how they're learning. Right now that's de-identified. When it's identified and the level of intrusion and attention to the privacy of those taking these classes, it's astonishing what will be possible. As an educator who is intrigued by trying to understand how young people are learning, as W once said, is our children learning, how that's happening, we wrestle endlessly with assessment and trying to understand better ways to do it. This is a quantum leap in that regard, but I think the consequences or the potential consequences for privacy are profound. Last thing, we think of this technology, or it's often described as remarkable because it can reach so many people at once. As Andy said, 2 million people taking one, or actually as Mike said, 2 million people taking one class. That's not what our students want today. They want specific, individualized, curated learning experiences. I think it is possible to take this technology and find an audience that specifically wants that particular experience and deliver it to them. I'll give an example here at Wake Forest. We may not be in that 20 of 22 group that Lynn described, but the mini MOOCs that are offered by this library, ZSRX, How to Be a Parent of a College Student, is a mini MOOC developed by Wake Forest through ZSRX, through the library, delivered to Wake Forest parents. The usual rule of thumb for those who start a MOOC and wind up finishing the course is about 12% of the students. This was about 99.5% of these parents finished the course they began about how to be a good parent of a college student. So that kind of experience, I think, does provide some of the best of times opportunities. Downsides worry me greatly.
Let me just say, for those in the back row standing, there's 2 empty rows down front if you care to come down. Well, thank you all for that first question. We'll move on to question number 2, which is for Andy. Andy, you have enjoyed success in leading the national effort to transform what was formerly known as career services to a lifelong approach of personal and career development. And you've also been successful in demonstrating the value of a liberal arts degree. And yet some people are not getting your message. Governors of major states, such as our own, are talking about charging more for majors that do not have immediate job prospects. And President Obama has recently questioned the value of a degree in art history. There was an article just this week in the Wall Street Journal that talked about using salary prospects as a way to choose a college major. So the question is, what do you say to new students and to their parents who want to assess the return on investment of a particular major at the beginning of their child's college career and steer towards subjects that will guarantee a high starting salary?
I think one of the things that people are asking is, one, just the value of higher education. Separate from that, people are asking about the value of liberal arts, the value of a Wake Forest University degree. So there's all these different levels. One of the things that I think that our politicians, they're trying to find every way possible to sort of paint some different people as the enemy. If we can just fix this, everything will get taken care of. So I think that's a challenge that we have. And what's interesting about those particular politicians is that whether it be President Obama or those big states have big budgets and big universities that they are in some ways trying to figure out, how do I get the financial situation under control? So I think that dynamic is very interesting in terms of how you think about the politics. I will say one thing about the politics that I found very interesting. So if any of you actually are very interested in this whole issue around the value of education, the value of college, last night I was doing some research, and on my Twitter feed, Chan Fuchsius, I tweeted about several amazing articles that have been written over the last 5 years about this. And so there is one thing about the earthquake that I said is, we have been actually not only talking about this for the last 5 years, but if you go back to Derek Bach, and even before that, this concept of the value of education has been talking about for like 30 years. And I think one of the things that most people who are in the liberal arts especially are losing track of what is the real purpose of college. And so the sad part about it is that the media as well as politicians have actually reduced the purpose of college to be very pragmatic about getting a job. And with the rising costs, they're actually trying to say it has to be about that, because why would you pay so much if it weren't for just about getting a job? So the number one thing I always really try to first ask people about is, for yourselves, anyone who's a parent out there, is how do you think about what the purpose of college is? And for those of you who are students, what do you think is about the purpose of college? And this is one of those things that I find very interesting, is that when people take the time to think a little bit more deeply about what the purpose of college is, they do not say it's to get a job. That's what's interesting, is that there may be certain populations of people who that's actually the way they think, but I think for most of the people who tend to be in the audience who are looking at schools like Wake Forest, it tends to be more than just about getting a job or getting a good job. I think they think that one of the things that should be on there, but it's not the number one thing, and it is a lot more about figuring out where they're going in their lives. And I think that's another thing that's tricky about all this, is that there are just so many different sort of types of people out there, from those who don't have much in terms of income or coming as first generation, for example. Their needs and their issues are a lot different than the people who actually are very wealthy. So I will say that the other thing that's really interesting is that what we've been able to do, which was very important, was just get some data around where do your students go. And I think for most schools who are in the elite liberal arts college group, which I would put us in, is that most of their students actually have pretty positive outcomes. I think that that's one of the things, if they could only gather that data and report the data, share that data with their faculty, as we have with many of you here in this room, you start to see that your students do have very good outcomes. But the challenge is that you actually have to create an environment, which is a college just like Wake Forest is, where everyone is part of helping students figure out those answers. And it's not only with what you do in your office, but it's also what you do in the classroom. So one of the phrases that I oftentimes like to use today, and this comes out of just some data, as many of you have heard with Rogan's talk about Gen Y, that one number that's always really compelling is the number of jobs that college students are expected to have over their lifetime. 29. Anywhere between 20 and 30 jobs. The reality, it's a lot of jobs. So if you really think about from a skill standpoint, what they really need to learn is, how do I navigate change? How do I understand who I am, how I'm uniquely wired, what I care about, what kind of life I want to lead, so that when change happens, I can find a way to actually navigate through that. Or I can be in front of it, so I can be productive to actually develop the skills to help me to that next thing. That's sort of one very key point, which is we're actually trying to develop people for competency development, both personal and professional, not just skills, not just for a job, especially not just that first job. Because I can say in most groups, when I say, how many of you in your first job, you love that first job and you're still doing it today? Most people said, I hated my first job, I did it, I learned a lot, and I'm glad I actually am not doing that anymore. So why are we actually putting so much value on the first job? That's craziness. The second number I think of, it came out the Economist article in January. If you look for it, it's a cover of a tornado blowing through an office building. And what it basically, these researchers from Oxford found out is that in the next 2 decades, 47% of the jobs that exist today are going to be gone. Anything that involves some kind of pattern recognition is gone. Some legal jobs, accounting jobs, medical technician jobs, even cab drivers. I actually see today in the Bay Area, there are cars driving around with no driver, right? So anything that we have is how we think the world works. We have to be thinking it's not going to be the same. So helping our students understand that change is about to happen, preparing them for change, is much more important than preparing them for one job. And I think we all are starting to understand that, but I will tell you that our students, as much as change they've experienced in their life, they actually don't want to hear that because they're afraid. Like, that sounds horrible. Like, I'm going to school, I've worked so hard all the way through my whole life to get to college, to get to this point, I'm working so hard, and now actually I'm trying to get a job, and it's not going to be my job forever. Like, we actually have to help people understand that's okay. That's just the way the world's going to be. And we can help you actually navigate through that, and liberal arts education is a big part of that. So I think that's sort of where I would stop at this point, that it is really important to know that I think what we do is clearly a value. What's great is that we're actually proving that to the world, and I think actually a lot of people in the world are trying to figure out how we're doing it. They don't have to do it the way that we've done it at Wake Forest. They have their own models, but at least they're trying and thinking about it. But the biggest thing that I've seen at any other school as to why it's not working is that somewhere between the culture of the school, which includes especially the faculty, and the leadership of the school, they know that it's important, but they actually don't want to actually spend any time on it. So then what happens is that they talk about how it's important, but nothing ever happens. So my colleagues who work at all schools around the country, great ones, not so great ones, big ones, small ones, they're really struggling. Like this conversation that I've been having for 5 years since I've been here, some of them haven't even started. And that's why we do what we do, is we go out there and we talk about it, because we're trying to help, honestly, all students all around the world to actually have more preparation for life after college.
I cede most of this ground to Andy, so I'll simply, with good reason, but I'll offer one quick story. One of the biggest critics of the return on investment that we provide is Peter Thiel, one of the founders of PayPal, who is an early retired trillionaire. And he's very critical. He says that no one measures the return that higher education offers. In fact, he goes on to say it's inappropriate even to ask the question of what the return is, and when you do, you get bromides about, well, it prepares you to be a citizen, you're not supposed to learn something specific. And he's quite prominent, has a big platform, and in fact, he's put his money where his mouth is. As you probably know, he puts $1 million a year into this Thiel Fellowships, where he persuades high school seniors, or in some cases, they get to college, as freshmen. He gives them each $100,000 to skip going to college and come work, and often gets them set up in the Bay Area just working. And it's a kind of social experiment in whether version of critique is accurate. And I love this little anecdote that one of his first classes 2 years ago of Teal Fellows included a Wake Forest freshman, a young man who'd been here 2 months but had already been in the pipeline and won the $100,000 and went out to the Bay Area, and after a few months came back and said he missed his early experience at Wake Forest, and he is a junior here and will continue. And goodbye, Peter Teal.
So just a quick point or two to lend my perspective to this. So I think Andy made an absolutely fabulous point, which is important to remember in every bit of the conversation here today, which is the purpose question. What's the goal of higher education? And the fact is, higher education is not monolithic. Believe it or not, not every institution of higher education out there in the world looks like Wake Forest, okay? There are a lot of different models, a lot of different permutations, a lot of different combinations, and for different students, different places make great sense. So the purpose of the education is critical. When I came to Wake Forest, I came here because I had a great English professor, English teacher in high school who was a Wake Forest graduate who sold me on this place. I came here, studied English, graduated during the recession of '81, had no idea where I was going to find a job. One of my professors had a connection with a former student in Lexington. I got lucky enough to get the job. And I realized that as I've been hiring, and I think I'm on job 12 or 13 now, Andy, so I'm not, my wife wonders if I can keep jobs for longer than 2 or 3 years, so I may be, more like a 21-year-old. I wish I was in some ways. But every time I've gotten a new job, I've had to hire a lot of people. And the people that I look to hire are the kind of students that Wake Forest is producing because they're critical thinkers, they're analytic, they've learned how to work with others, they've learned how to work in teams. They bring a sense of rigor and curiosity and dynamism to the workplace. I think this is exactly the right way to prepare folks, but not everybody's going to get prepared this way. And you know what? That's okay.
Okay, let's go on to question number 3. Rogan, this is for you. It's about tenure, which coincidentally came up just yesterday in the Faculty Senate meeting that we attended. So at that meeting it was stated Wake Forest College has roughly 80% of its faculty members on tenure or tenure track, and that's not the norm actually across the country. Nationwide numbers of tenured or tenure track faculty members have declined from maybe 50% down to about 1/3. So there's a clear national trend downward on tenure. The AAUP commonly states that academic freedom is the reason that tenure is necessary. But in fact, cases involving academic freedom of teaching and learning expression are in fact very, very rare. So I found this startling quote, and here's where, this is not necessarily me, but I just want to read. Milton Greenberg, writing in the Chronicle of Higher Education, stated, "The dirty little secret of tenure is its protection of doctrinal orthodoxy and curricular inflexibility to accommodate long-serving faculty, which accounts for the perception and the reality of an enterprise resistant to change." Wow. So Rogan, what do you see in the future for tenure? Will it exist in 20 years here at Wake Forest or elsewhere? Why or why not?
I think it will. There is clearly a, I think, disturbing trend of declining proportion of faculty, especially at lower-ranked institutions who are tenured. But academic freedom is it's a powerful term, and we tend in periods where academic freedom is not under assault or regularly challenged and this is by no means the first time that tenure has been questioned. You go back a number of periods in this country and other countries that have tenure's history, and there's a sort of feeling of comfort, and then questions start to arise. But beyond academic freedom, as vital and important as that is, I think tenure has some other vital benefits. One is tenured faculty members, once they're through that hurdle, become intellectual leaders in the community. They have a certain level of stability as opposed to a kind of temporary, uncertain place in their institution, and are able to extend outward while doing the remarkable teaching and creative research work they do. They can also take positions of significant leadership in universities that still are governed by faculty, or at least shared governance takes place to a significant degree. It's hard to engage in that if you are uncertain about your prospects for continuing in that institution. Service is a hard part of the faculty equation when you're judged and tenured and then promoted eventually based on your teaching and research or creative work productivity. So I think a little spoken but very powerful, especially from where I sit as someone who reaches out constantly to faculty members across this institution, asking them, imploring them, begging them, arm twisting them, incentivizing them, bribing them, to engage in the incredibly time-demanding work of shared governance of these enormously complex institutions that modern universities have become. If you don't have tenure, and or if you're constantly being reviewed annually, the way, yes, the rest of the world is, it's very difficult to get people to step up and do service, because it's hard to find the rewards for that. So I think it's a little spoken but very powerful aspect of the benefits of tenure. Another benefit, I think, is that we are asked to judge the potential as faculty members of prospective professors, of folks coming into the community. And I think it's difficult to do that when your own status and place in an institution is uncertain. Now again, other people in other kinds of institutions hire folks, but you're hiring family members in this respect, and you're coming into a department, and we spend, many faculty spend more of their lives with their colleagues than they do with their families because of the nature and demands of the job. If we're going to ask faculty to honestly judge the potential prospective professors, it's why it's tenured faculty who vote on new entrants to the community. You need to have a kind of security yourself and be willing to say, all right, this young whippersnapper with all these innovative, exciting ideas can come in and threaten some of what I think and do, but I'm willing to make that decision because I have a kind of security already. So it's an awfully complex conversation, of course, and there's an easy lob to throw against tenure, and you quoted a version of it, which is tenure enables people to mail in their classes and check out of serious research or creative work. And I don't see a lot of that at places like Wake Forest. It may be happening elsewhere, but it feels to me that the arguments on behalf of this, it is a peculiar, strange practice, but the arguments on its behalf are pretty powerful ones. And I will say that the handful of institutions that have, with a lot of public fanfare, decided to either get rid of or diminish the importance of tenure have not done well as a result. The most prominent institution, the highest ranked institution to do away with tenure was Bennington, which tried this experiment maybe 15 years ago and summarily got rid of tenure for everyone there, and most of the finest faculty at Bennington left, and they realized their mistake and hastily put it back in place. Hastily at a university was a couple years. And they have, I have friends who teach at Bennington, if those of you who may as well, who collaborate with folks at Bennington, they have had a difficult time restoring their former glory to place. So I have a primarily affirmative sense of it. The one thing I'd say that I could imagine if Wake Forest as a community decided we wanted to try something like this, and we were worried about continued productivity and so on, is something like 5-year peer review. Not some supervisor like a provost sitting in judgment of or dean sitting in judgment of a faculty member, but have folks, peers in the department, tenured peers, so again, junior faculty are protected, every 5 years go through a kind of elaborate, decisive review with sort of the kind of 360 universal review that administrators and staff members face on a regular basis, and have one's peers make some suggestions and judgments. I could imagine something like that. A few universities have moved in that direction, but I think removing this pillar of how we organize ourselves is powerful. So I suspect that may be an antiquated view, a medieval-looking view, but it feels to me like the right one.
So I can't believe that Rogan would not fully agree with something that was in the Chronicle of Higher Education.
Well, they argued the opposite view the week before.
I'm just stunned. The tenure question is one that I find perplexing. Now, here's a confession. I'm actually an imposter on this panel. I have 10 months of experience in my job. These guys are the experts here. So I may be talking out of school and know just enough to be dangerous. But I was an adjunct once, full confession, at Georgetown. I taught journalism at Georgetown when I was living in Washington back in the 90s. Loved it. Adjuncts come in all different shapes, styles, and sizes. One of the reasons we're seeing adjuncts grow as a percentage of the professoriate, in 1950, I think 75% or so of the professoriate was tenure track. Now it's down to roughly 30% and almost 70% adjuncts. It's a cost-saving method in many ways at many institutions because adjuncts don't get paid a lot. We've written stories about adjuncts who are on welfare, living out of their car, teaching at 5 universities in New York just to keep it together. We're creating a set of second-class citizens in institutions of higher learning with adjuncts. That's a concern of mine. More directly to the tenure question, my question and the nobility of the notion of tenure, I agree with completely. And when I was here at Wake, I was a huge supporter of the notion of tenure and tenured faculty. But the rub is going to come when the faculty that it's very secure in their position comes up hard against the notion of change. And what I can't begin to unwrap at this point is how that conflict resolves itself. It's very hard when you have a lifetime appointment to be able to really embrace, challenge, confront, deal with change. You can just ignore it. And I think that's going to be bad for institutions where the faculty can just say, whatever, I've got tenure.
I'd like to just say that the things that I observe about this is, in principle, tenure has great merits and intention, but I question what the long-term affordability of tenure is when you think about institutions. In some ways, I parallel it with Social Security. We have a debate about Social Security. Are we going to be able to afford Social Security? At the time when it was created, it was made for a reason, and it looked like it would be affordable, but now today it's not. And I ask, probably at a lot of universities, they're asking that same thing. So under financial pressure, they move to the model that Mike described. So we may be able to find a way to afford not to change, but everyone's actually having to ask that question because it's a financial question as opposed to the principled question. And the second is, to reinforce what Mike just said, is that I think in a lot of ways tenure reinforces the positive about tradition. It creates a tradition-based culture. But one of the things that actually is difficult is, does it actually create an innovation-based culture? And if a tsunami is about to hit, are you going to be okay with a tradition-based culture? Well, I think if you're Harvard with an endowment of $9 billion or whatever it might be, I think you're fine. But if you're not, what do you do? Because one of the things is that my sense is that there are some groups where over time they've reinforced we're going to find people who are a lot like us because that's the way we think and we're all together here. And so we have a nice club in our department because we're all doing the same thing. So in some ways you would arguably say it could actually diminish the opportunity for diversity. It could diminish the opportunity to seriously innovate. That's the one thing. The second is that the time for when you actually hear about what's the time where people come up with the most volume of ideas and have the most energy to innovate is before they're 35 years old. So if you're actually asking your young people who are these PhDs to work hard to get tenure during that time, you're actually forcing them to do things that are not about innovation. It's actually about getting tenure. And there's a way to get there. And so what happens is then when you get to tenure, I bet many of you are tired. So how can you innovate at that point? And I do think that that's a challenge. And then actually the last thing is something that Hunter Rawlings, the former president of Cornell, spoke about, the current president of AAU. I was on a panel with him. He said, the other piece about that's tricky is that we were talking about the humanities and the potential demise of the humanities. And he said one of the reasons why he feels like we within the academy are hurting ourselves is that we have created departmental walls that have polarized our faculty, even within the humanities. So that what happens is that we actually are striving to create our own little fiefdoms, so we're actually not working disciplinary ways. It's very hard to do. Now, I know that we are doing it here at Wake Forest, but the question I would have is everyone doing it? Is everyone incentivized to do it? Is that part of the culture? I know that we're trying to make it happen, but you see that every university, there's all these interdisciplinary things going on, but is it 5% of the faculty or is it 50% of the faculty? I just think that's a challenge when you have tenure.
Okay, thank you. Question number 4 goes to Mike, and it's about the unsustainable costs of higher education. January 2013, Moody's changed its outlook for the entire U.S. higher education sector to negative, saying that all but the most elite universities face diminished student demand and increased price insensitivity, or price sensitivity. Many, if not most, Americans just can't afford the cost of a college degree. On the White House website, it has figures that the sticker price of tuition has increased 250% in the last 3 decades, while the typical family income has not come anywhere close to that. Average college student graduates with $26,000 in debt. So in January 2014, just 2 months ago, I know the Chronicle covered the White House Summit, inviting 100 college presidents to come and talk about how to increase access to education and contain the costs. The price of admission to the summit was to come with a pledge on how your college could reduce costs. So Mike, you've been covering higher education now 10 months. Imagine you're the president of Wake Forest University. What pledge would you make to realistically and effectively reduce costs at Wake Forest?
I'm glad you took note of my expertise in this field. Thank you. It's interesting, and I don't think it's as simple as making a pledge. I think there are a lot of factors that come into play. I happen to personally know this space right now. I have a daughter who just graduated from college last spring. I have another daughter who is a sophomore, and I haven't put the numbers together, but I think my wife and I are something like $300,000 plus into college at this point in terms of an investment. And as a journalist, I can tell you, we're not big breadwinners. So just the thought of doing this has forced us to sort of recast our whole notion in terms of what's the value of the quality. I think the conversation is changing, and I think Nathan is one of the people out there who is helping to change the conversation, because you really have the question at its heart of what's the value of an education. And that, to me, is the ratio of the quality of what you're getting, given whatever your purpose or goal is, and the cost that you pay. Wake Forest, sticker price of $52K all in now, something like that. I think, Rogan, I can't remember. Is it? 59. Okay, 59 all in. For some families, for some students, that may be a bargain. That may be the right value. What I think college presidents need to do is figure out ways that you keep these costs from rising. And I think that's going to mean some real challenge to things that are sacred cows. I think the technology and reducing cost in that fashion is one thing. I think taking a hard look at the growth of where your cost centers in the universities are over the last 10 years. Wake Forest, I imagine, like most schools of its size and its caliber, has probably watched administrative costs rising pretty rapidly over the last 10 to 15 years. And probably a big chunk of that is fundraising, frankly. And you know what? To Andy's point, we don't have a really big endowment. We don't have a big rainy day fund here to weather the storms like a Harvard or a Stanford or a Duke. It's a critical position. This place, I assume, is not fully tuition dependent, but there is a big tuition dependent element of this. As the conversation changes, one of the things we've done at the Chronicle is put together a website called collegerealitycheck.com, because as more and more parents are scrutinizing the value of college, mostly because of this rising cost. I mean, it's rising faster than healthcare costs. They need to know some things. They need to know, okay, what's the sticker price? Sticker price here is $59. The net price is probably much lower here for students, I would guess, right? So that's what students really pay. It's kind of like, buying a car. The question of what's the debt that these students leave with per institution? What is the likelihood that of the salary they're going to make the first year or two out of school? And what's their graduation rate of a school? Do you graduate most of your students in 4 years? Does it take 6 years? Does it take 8 years? All of these factors come into play to making really smarter decisions on the front end. And I think ultimately for somebody like Nathan, sort of having educated consumers that are deciding, if I'm going to pay the freight to go to Wake Forest, I've decided that it's valuable and it's worth it to me. If not, you know what? There are other schools you can look at that probably might be a few dollars cheaper, and maybe be in more of a sweet spot for you.
So the tricky part about this question is a little what Mike alluded to, is that we have such a huge market now, and there's so many different choices people have. And I think one of the things that most people who are now buyers of education are deceived into believing is that there's only a certain set of schools that are the right ones that you should go to. And I think Mike said this earlier, is that there are actually a lot of different schools that are really, really good in different kinds of ways, depending on what you need. The number of students actually who now go to community college before they go to college, great option, right? A lot of kids actually learn a lot in those situations. Some people are actually going to these online schools, and that's what they want because they want to do very vocationally oriented things. So I think in some ways, this is where I wish the politicians would actually, rather than talking about sort of taking on education, go to, let's talk about all the good things that education does in America in different kinds of ways for different kinds of people, like in a more positive tone about all that it does. That would just be so much more inspiring and uplifting about the pride we have in America to be so innovative and so entrepreneurial, to have all these options for people. The land of choice. You can have it, and those choices are good for you. You just have to be thoughtful about what those choices are. Not that the feeling is there's only a few good choices, and those choices better come down in cost, or else those are bad choices. Because what I would say is, related to Mike, is that for some people, the reality is that it's worth it for that individual and family to pay the high price. And for some people, and you can say this about a lot of the elite liberal arts schools, they have such huge endowments that their student body has many, many students who are getting huge scholarships to be able to go. We're actually always trying to fight to actually add more to that list, so that's just sort of the challenge that we have at Wake Forest. But the reality is, I think, in talking to Mark Peterson, who's in advancement, if we give ourselves, honestly, 20 years, that we will have we'll have the kind of endowment that can actually have a lot more people with the scholarships that we can give. But we're just not there at this moment in time. And that's I think that's an interesting dynamic here. So back to cost, and rather than maybe the word of not cost cutting, I think of two things. So one is, when you have the opportunity to make strategic investments, to be more thoughtful about those where they are based on long-term financial sustainability, and that it makes sense given the overall balanced program. So what happens is that if you have a liberal arts school, you may have certain things which you could call, they cost us a lot, but they're part of the value proposition of what the school is about. And there are other programs that actually make us money because of popularity or because of where the alumni go and the money they give back. But you don't have to have your whole school go to one and at the expense of the other. It's about the whole thing being in balance, but you have to be strategic about it. So that's important to think about. And it's been interesting. Like, we are doing that here at Wake Forest. I actually think when we think about things like new master's programs, we actually have conversations about, let's talk really seriously about, where do those students have the potential to go? Is there a market for them? And if there is are we going to have actually good students who are able to come in and pay for it to be able to go through? Like, the whole system works from the beginning to end. That's a good thing, as opposed to you just come up with an academic program just for the heck of it, just to see what happens. There might have been a day where you felt like you could do that, but I think more schools are being more thoughtful about that. And the other thing is that I think we have to think about is just new revenue streams. Whatever you do, is there some way that maybe what you do has a way to make revenues? So like down in Charlotte, we actually have an executive education, and also we're developing like a lifelong education program. And it may be that there's something that you offer that people would actually pay for that could put a little money in your pocket, as well as put some money into the pocket of the university. And so I can tell you, like in our world, personal, career, and professional development, we are scheming all the time to try to think about ways that we can get money from corporations, from students from other schools, from alumni, from adults, because we actually are trying to think there's got to be a way we can help get more revenue to help both pay for what we do, but also help the university as a whole. So all of you might actually have that kind of thing. That is just a very different way of thinking about what a university has to do to be able to be financially sustainable.
Mike set out the parameters well, and Andy's taken us more specifically and strategically into Wake Forest. I will say that as a chief academic officer, I've never imagined spending as much time as I have this first year and a half on the question of cost. And it's it's been quite an education. I will say that Wake Forest is moving what feels like decisively now to set ourselves up for the kind of future you envision. This coming year's tuition increase will be the lowest in 35 years. We have been through a 2-year exercise on trying to either reduce or at least reallocate costs. That's involved a great many of the folks in this room, faculty members, all our deans. I see Dean Fetro and Dean Sutton's here on the stage, and others who've been, again, we might imagine ourselves primarily involved in academic mission and programs and so on, but we've got to be attentive to this. So I think, in a way, the Obama administration, let's remember, it's really the first U.S. presidential administration in a long time to pay much attention to higher education. Most of Department of Education activities over the however long years have been on K through 12. All those race to the tops and No Child Left Behinds and et cetera, Nation at Risk, have been about that level. And the fact that they've shown a spotlight in our direction is, I think there's been we're not the only school that's going through this elaborate effort. I think we might have done it for our own purposes, but you're feeling some of this nationally. We've taken a really hard look at things like staff growth. Mike's right, that's helped drive at Wake as well as many other places this sharp increase in costs over the last quarter century that you referred to. Our staff growth this year is the lowest it's been probably as a percentage in probably 30 years, and will be even lower next year. So I think we're trying very thoughtfully without slashing the core of our value proposition, what we do, what we hold dearest, our academic programs and practices. I think we're able to orient ourselves in a way that I think will set ourselves up for as these enormous sums that we're beginning to be able to raise. Many of these capital campaign projects or programs or donations come in over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. I think we'll be in a very good place to harvest that and spend that and allocate that money wisely. So it is, again, it's been a remarkable education, but I think it's also been a fruitful one. And it's been, I think, across the institution. Many of you in this room have been engaged in this question about how do we most fruitfully and usefully allocate what are precious resources.
Our friends in media, this doesn't seem to help very. Discovered that it's my microphone that's been causing the problem, so I have a handheld now, so maybe this will be better. Andy, the next question is about changing demographics. There's a wealth of data out there to mine. I'm sure that you have seen and studied a lot of it. What it seemed to boil down to me was that the number of high school graduates will drop sharply over the next decade, particularly in the prototypical Wake Forest student who is wealthy and white and from the northeastern to Atlantic coast region. There's this line that I love that I read from an enrollment manager who says, if they aren't born, they aren't going to college. The only growth areas that there seem to be are among poor Hispanic students. And if those poor Hispanic students are going to be our next college students, they need a lot of help in terms of financial aid, which we just discussed is scarce. In other times of population decline, schools have used the tactic of recruiting people returning to school, older students who want a chance of getting a better job. But we don't really have any of that at Wake Forest, so that's not our undergraduate population base. So I guess the question is, are we going to run out of students? Is there maybe a chance for Wake Forest to redefine itself, maybe go back to our roots? What do you think?
Interesting question. I think that at the high level, these are big numbers where you see these changes in the little market that we are in, and we are very small in the big sea of all of higher education, of all of population. I think that we do have a particular niche that actually is it's a very promising one, but the problem I think we have as prices go up is that market starts to get smaller. So we do have this issue. It's this race of trying to figure out how do we raise our endowment and get funding fast enough to continue to have the scholarships to get that very targeted group of the right undergraduate student. I think that's actually a really interesting question in general that's good for us to all keep talking about further. I will say that, though, I don't think that we're standing still. So, one of the thoughts was is this whole big island of people who want, like, what we have to offer going to get so small that we're going to get kicked off the island. What I would say is that we're extending. So when I think about our online master's in counseling program, when I think about the new master's programs in the different graduate schools, this executive education and lifelong learning that we're doing in Charlotte, the different business school programs like the MA program that's extended into students after college, like we've actually already gotten in front of that a bit. And I can tell you actually even in our office, we're looking at things like people who are coaches or counselors. Those kinds of people, there is a proliferation of them over the last couple decades in terms of just the counseling field and the coaching field. They all need to have ongoing certifications. We actually could see ourselves developing something, actually in partnership with ZSR, to actually have something that's offered to those kinds of people. So I would say that we're not sitting as still as it may have perceived that we are. So I'm not as worried about that as an issue for us.
Well, I'm worried nationally for the reason you described, but I think if we'd set out, say 5 years ago, to figure out these demographic trends and begin to reorient the incoming first-year class to Wake Forest accordingly, in some ways we couldn't have done a better job. Nationally, the three biggest growth areas, so to speak, the three largest percentage increases in new students are Latino, Asian American, and international. The three largest growth areas at Wake Forest for the last 5 to 7 years are Latino, Asian American, and international. Another large demographic group that we're going to see coming to college in greatest numbers, and I think you implied this if not said directly, is first-generation students. And Wake has, I think, been a leader, maybe a laggard leader. I don't know what it was like 20 years ago, but a leader recently in organizing ourselves to make not only a welcome home for first-generation students, but actively to go seek and recruit and partner with schools and high schools, that is, and charter schools and so on that are bringing those students forward. So I don't think one should be sanguine. I mean, the world of demographics is not always predictive of the world of young people who decide to go to college, and the disruptive effects that we've been describing here in some ways are scariest when it comes to, are we going to have students who still want to come here? Wake has been in a remarkable position lately, as a lot of our peer schools have seen application numbers flatten. We have shot up in recent years. The test optional decision was clearly one that helped to drive some of the factors I'm describing, but it was a timely decision, and I think that our scrutiny and attention and concern and lack of interest in sitting still has reaped rewards so far. So I feel optimistic, and I wake up early worrying about this at the same time.
So let me be on the really worried side for a second. I'm just curious, how many of you visit the Chronicle website? Chronicle.com? Okay, good. I like that. This is very good.
Close your eyes and we'll do it again.
Yeah, right, exactly. See, you're my survey research. So if you go to the website, you can tell we really care a lot about data and demographics and those sorts of things. We'll be doing a whole lot more of that. But one of the things we did recently, we took the census data from the most recent census, and we looked at 4-year-olds. And we looked at 4-year-olds across the nation, because we know in 14 years these 4-year-olds are going to be going to college, or could be going to college, right? And we said, give us a breakdown across the country of the demographics of this group. And what you see in that group are people of color. You see people of lower incomes rising in the numbers, all of which creates for me a real concern about higher education. I think Wake's going to be fine and weather the storm, because I think here the niche is very clearly defined, and I think the things that Wake is doing proactively to deal with some of these troubles are fine. But I really worry about higher education in general, because I think there is an increasing inequality that's being actually perpetuated by institutions of higher education in many ways. And I look at these kids who in 14 years have the opportunity to go to college. I don't know if they're going to go, that they're going to be prepared to go, or that they can afford to go. And that's a huge concern for me. And one of the questions is, can Wake Forest play a role in that, both in its institution and in the broader sense of institutions in higher education, about this being a legitimate, serious concern?
All right, next question is for Rogan. This is about failure. Some colleges are already starting to fail.
Glad you got that one.
The Chronicle, again, is full of stories about regional state schools who are not making their enrollments, about small liberal arts colleges without strong endowments that are beginning to lay off tenured faculty or even close altogether. Our friend Clay Christensen, who I cited earlier, predicts that the bottom 25% of every tier of higher education will disappear or merge over the next 10 to 15 years. Now, it is true, Wake Forest is not in the bottom 25%, in the top. But this question is maybe really a plea. Reassure us that we will not be one of those who fails, but also talk about what that crumbling underneath, what effect that will have on us, and what it will do to the industry.
There's an interesting view, and I think it's run through this forum as well as most of the conversation about higher ed, that presents universities and colleges very much in that medieval format you showed. These are these ancient, mossy, crumbling, non-innovative, disruption, terror. I mean, these are some of the most dynamic, active, closing and opening institutions that exist in society and have been for a long time. In the state of North Carolina, how many colleges and universities over the years, go back to the beginning, the 1760s, have closed or changed names and dramatically shifted across the last 150 years or so? 130 in this state alone. Colleges constantly close, open, morph, remodel, do different things. I mean, give you 3 examples. I was intrigued by this notion. Some of them are famous in North Carolina. Black Mountain College, the John Cage, Merce Cunningham, Marvelous Experiment. You sort of think of that as still sort of right there near Asheville. It existed for 23 years, but its reach has been distinctive beyond that. Others have closed or changed for specific reasons. Claremont College, which was in Hickory, was the Reformed German Church's institution of choice. Well, there is no more Reformed Germans, or not many anyhow, so the college went away some years ago. And there's ones like David Caldwell's Log College, which just, it's a precious name, but it existed for 100 years, actually, into the 19th century. This sector is actually long been subject to enormous disruptions and changes and abilities to adapt. Now, some have closed and gone, but I think that our sense of the sector has somehow gotten frozen. And in part, that's probably true of many sectors that are going through change. You're anxious about it. You imagine that, well, things have been a certain way for a while, at least in my lifetime. And colleges and universities have adapted in remarkable ways. Antioch College is the one that, if you do a Chronicle search, in fact, of college and close, Antioch comes up 125 times, and small regional ones maybe once in a while. Antioch College has closed and reopened 4 times in its history. 1860s, 1880s, 1920s, and yes, 2008. It's open again, and it's doing okay. So I worry about many of the themes that have been expressed here, there is an urgency around our ability to acknowledge and organize ourselves so that we're able to surf these waves or resist the waves as they prove to be fads. But I worry less about the sector itself. It may be that we absorb technology at rates that aren't as fast as other institutions in society, but look, yes, some colleges will close and reopen, and if it was 1766, the same thing will be happening then. So that's maybe too sanguine a view. I've been the optimist on many of these questions, but I'm going to stand strong by that. 130 schools in this state alone. So what? That more will. That more will.
Not us.
Right. Exactly.
Mike.
Well, Rogan, I'm glad you mentioned Black Mountain College. My mother went to Black Mountain College, so in several of the 23 years it was there.
I hope only 4.
Yeah, right. No, actually, she didn't graduate from there. She ended up graduating. She got married. The war started. She left. She ended up finishing, got her BA at Goddard College in Vermont. Anyhow, you guys didn't need to know that, did you? I'm going to be a little less sanguine than Rogan. I think, again, that's part of my role on this panel. But also, when you look at the precarious state of a lot of institutions, and one of the things that I want us to do at the Chronicle is create a matrix where we understand what are some of the factors that are most likely to cause an institution in what I do believe is going to be the coming shakeout over the next 10 to 12, 15 years. What are the things that are most likely to put it at peril, to put it at risk? And I think there are some shared characteristics, and I think there are schools in that bottom tier of 25%, however you want to define it, that are going to fail. There's some probably above that tier that are going to fail, and there's some that are going to survive. But that's one of the challenges for higher education is things fail, things change, things reopen. I think your perspective is absolutely fascinating. I would never have guessed 130. So you would have won that bet. So
we live in an interesting time where the news is on our fingertips every second, and so what happens is that everything seems to be so much more painful and problematic than it might actually really be. And I think that's a little bit of where we're in. It's tricky. I'm a little bit more on the side where Rogan is, but I will still say what he is saying also is that there's going to be change, and that the question is, if your institution is actually not trying to actually make change happen, you're more likely to have it happen to you than if you actually being part of making it happen. So I think that's one of the things where it's good for each of us individually to step into what's the role that I can play to actually be part of the change, part of it both for me personally, but then also as part of my institution, so that we can actually move it, so that we're ahead of this thing. I think that's a really good question. I think a little bit to, not to totally tease it, what Mike does, or actually all these people in the high-tech industry, but I love this quote from Patricia McGuire, the president of Trinity Washington University. She said this, which I think is a good summary: "Beware of Chicken Little, because Chicken Little has a vested interest in the sky falling." Right? So between the media, U.S. News and World Report, and all these high-tech companies and venture capitalists who actually all have vested interest in the sky falling, it is totally in their interest to actually make a huge, huge deal. Now, it doesn't mean that we should sit and go, it's just Chicken Little, it's just Chicken Little, because maybe something does happen. But that's what's happening in this world right now, is everything's so hyped. And so we just have to figure out, okay, I don't want to get too hyped, but at the same time, I don't want to just sort of assume nothing's going to happen. We got to be playing. We got to be actually participating in it.
We may have time for one last question, and then we'll go to audience Q&A. And this is on admissions, and it goes to Mike. How do you choose a college? News publications of all kinds, like yours, run frequent stories about the admissions process, about how serious it is, how stressful it is, on parents and students. You have two daughters, apparently, who have just recently gone through this process. Despite the common application, there are still schools that have different policies, different timetables, different outcomes. There's very little transparency in the process. Rankings play an unhealthy role in student choice, and maybe particularly in parent choice. And then there's the SAT. Wake Forest made news 2 years ago by going SAT optional. And recent research just hit the news that looked like it was a good strategy, that it did not affect academic excellence, and in fact has brought increased diversity to the school. So there's a lot of questions here. I'll throw them out. Is the SAT dying? Will standardized testing disappear over time as a means of getting into college? What will take its place? And maybe the underlying question is, what is the best way to choose a school if you're a student? And then conversely, what is the best way for schools to choose their students?
Great questions. I kind of wish the SAT had died about 35 years ago. Frankly, I would have been a much happier person. And again, it's very personal for me, because we just went through this process with both of our daughters picking schools. And you would think, for someone who was educated at Wake Forest, his wife was educated at a great liberal arts school in Laurinburg, St. Andrews College, you would think that we would have been way more prepared to help our daughters navigate this process. We weren't. We were incredibly ignorant. We had a lot of learning to do. We turned to the places you would think we'd turn. Even though I didn't want to turn to U.S. News, of course, you look at U.S. News. Even though Martha Ullman and Bill Starling all had told me how crazy this is, how it creates these perverse incentives, we still naturally turn to it to sort of compare schools. It's just a natural human thing to do. One of the things I'd love to do at the Chronicle is figure out how to develop something that would replace that would be a little more thoughtful, a little more meaningful, and a lot more valuable to parents. So we went through this process with both daughters. I held back. I didn't push either of them to go to Wake because I knew that was going to be wrong. One of them applied, ended up going to Davidson, which was a great choice, and she loved Davidson. The other one didn't apply to Wake, ended up going to Dickinson in Pennsylvania. After about 6 weeks there, she realized this is not the place for me. The culture is not right. She was handling the academics just fine, but it was not the right sort of fit. She ended up transferring to Elon. My wife and I, tried to let them both make as much of the decision as they could. And here's what we came up with in terms of choosing. There is, and I'm not sure what the right analogy is, whether it's a line or a Venn diagram. I tend to live my life thinking of Venn diagrams, okay? It's just a really nice way to help me cope. And I'm not sure exactly which one is the right analogy, but there are colleges, as Andy said, that fall inside that circle in the Venn diagram or fall above that line. And, we were going to be happy with any of them outside of that. We were parents who tried to let them do it on their own, and I think that was the right choice. In retrospect, we were absolutely terrified for about a year and a half because we realized there's no really good way out there to understand in a rigorous analytic sense which is the right school. For my oldest daughter, it came down to this index when she visited schools. She looked at the footwear that students were wearing. She's going to kill me for saying this, but she looked at the footwear.
Is this the Wake daughter?
This is the Davidson daughter. This is the Davidson daughter. And she wanted to know the ratio of Birkenstocks and Chacos, right? And the higher that ratio, the more she liked the school. Go figure. Don't tell her I said that, please.
Can you top that, Rogan?
I can't top that. My role so far, I think, has been either to be sanguine or parochial. I'm going to be parochial here. Mike said it would be great to have a index or a metric or a measure or a something that was, I quote you, more meaningful, more valuable, and a lot more helpful to parents. And actually, the fellow is in this room, Phil Handwerk, our new director of institutional research, who graduated from Wake in 1993, who is developing exactly that. He's developing a tool called Make Your Own Rankings. He's working with a couple of graduate students, soon many more students. Some are going to be required to make this work. But Phil, correct me if I got this wrong, but there's 24 different variables that, I don't know if the Birkenstock ratio, but that could be our 25th. And the notion is using the same data the U.S. News people use, plugging the data in a legitimate, up-to-date kind of way, that anyone, any parent, any child can weight these 24 variables as they wish and make their own ranking. It won't end the conversation, but it'll be a nice way to replace your crude geometry Venn diagrams. Now, what if, along with that tool for individuals, this Make Your Own Rankings, again, Phil, shake your head, I've got this wrong, reside on the Wake Forest website. That's where you could go to use it. Not a bad thing for Wake, obviously. Everybody who logged in and used it, we'd capture the data. So what we'd actually wind up with is a kind of crowdsourced hive mind of what kind of weights actually mattered. There is this tyranny of U.S. News. One human being determines which weights or which variables matter most and what the weights are. What if Wake had the alternative, which was 24 or 25 Birkenstock variables, and we see what 100,000, a million, 10 million hits suggest matter most in terms of the weighting. I love this idea, and I'm glad Phil's here.
So, Phil, you need to tell me more afterwards.
Give a wave.
I have just two quick things. So one is that I mentioned how there's just going to be so many more choices for options where people can think about school. They're going to be able to think about delaying and doing it later. They're going to be thinking about getting specialized sort of components. I think that actually is going to make it much, much harder for everyone. And I think that, so for people who are thinking that they want to be like a college counselor, I think you will have a lifetime of work. It is like, people are going to pay because they're going to have to navigate this incredibly crazy world of what do I do for post-secondary education. I think it's going to make it harder for us because I think because people are going to have those choices, they're going to be, at some level, fewer people coming to us, unless, of course, we find a way to continue to do what we're doing, which is branding-wise, marketing-wise, image-wise, put ourselves in a position where people just like, this place is so unique and different, which we are right now. If we can find a way to stay that way, I think we have a very special place because we are not any of the major research universities, but we provide a college experience, and no one does. Very few people provide that same thing, so I think that's very special. The other, I guess, last thing I would say, what I wish was possible I wish that it were possible to actually have a conversation with people where they could be asked, so when you really think about your budget, what you really have, how much do you think is the appropriate amount of money that you can afford to pay to go to college? That would be a really helpful start, because then what would be nice to be able to say is, and then this, I believe this is that there are certain people who actually are sensing enough that they can say, I think that I'm actually going to be willing or interested in a career where I want a certain kind of lifestyle. And if I could actually find a way to then help people say, well, given that kind of lifestyle, given how much money you might both make and how much debt you need to take on, how do you actually then think about what the right kind of program, school, sort of direction you might take? There are some people who like, I don't have any idea, it's very open, very unsure, but the thing that I worry about most, and we are working on it here, which is I worry about most students who say, I don't care how much debt I take on, or have families says, I don't care how much debt I take on, I want you to go to the best school possible, and I just want to dream about what life might be like. Because I think it's a crime for people to come to school for college and to have what are $50,000, $75,000, $100,000 in debt and end up leaving with just sort of a dream of what life could be like and be carrying that to start your life. Like, it's just a lot of money, and I wish I could find a way to just stop people from doing that, because the idea of going to school just on a dream, I feel like when you had a small debt, you could find a way to make it up. When the world seemed so much more clear, at least America in the state that it was in the last 30 years was very healthy. But at least if we were to try to project the next 30 years for America compared to the way it has been, I don't think we think it's going to be the same. So I think it's unfair to actually tell your child or the parents themselves, just put yourself in big, huge debt because it'll all work out for your kid. I just think that's hard. So.
Okay, we'll now move to the audience Q&A portion. There are many ways you can ask questions of the panelists. You can come down to one of the microphones, you raise your hand, and someone will bring you a microphone. Or you can send a question to the Big Disrupt. Jackie Fetro had her hand up first.
Thanks. This is not.
I don't think they really work.
You can project, Jackie.
Yes, I am. I'm a classroom teacher, so I can project. So this has been an interesting conversation. Thanks, Lynn, for hosting it, and thanks, Mike and Rogan and Andy for participating. My question is about, we are an institution, and all of us are institutions of higher education, that is really about student learning and the student experience. Andy's touched a little bit on student outcomes, but my question for you all is, how will the Big Disrupt impact student learning and student experience? Or maybe the better question is, how should it impact student learning and the student experience while they're here on campus?
Powerful question, and we've framed the going to college value question often in terms of, or it often gets framed in terms of what's the return on investment financially. There's also the whether going to college is worthwhile in terms of the value you get in an academic sense. I'm glad you raise it and bring it about that way. I think of the very disturbing book published a couple years ago by Richard Arum of NYU and a colleague at Virginia called Academically Adrift, which suggests that a lot of today's students, when they graduate, have learned almost nothing. They use this college learning assessment, the CLA, and had a huge sample of students, and they tested them as first years as they entered, and they tested them when they graduated. They did 4-year graduates, and 36% of those students had declined in their learning abilities over 4 years. 36%, and of the other 64%, do I have that number right? The gains were relatively minimal. It was a very worrisome finding, and it's, I know, got folks here and across the country wondering about the kinds of skills that we're supplying. Once again, I feel sanguine about Wake Forest in this respect, but it's a disturbing trend nationally. They look at particularly critical thinking, complex reasoning, and written communication as 3 keys. And I know that not by coincidence, Jackie and others at Wake, as we're about to go through this accrediting round, and 3 of the key themes we're emphasizing and trying to make sense of and trying to understand department by department, school by school, how well are we doing in conveying valuable lessons in critical thinking, complex reasoning, and written communication. I would add oral communication to that, although it's a little harder to test, though it seems essential in the world many of our students are entering. So here I'll say this is a worrisome aspect of the story. I feel better about the kinds of what we bring to classrooms here, and I don't know what's going to be the trend going forward. I will say that a number of large research universities, including two I have spent time at recently, you see a real internal conversation about moving, if there's a spectrum where heavy emphasis on teaching, liberal arts college style, heavy emphasis on research and creative work, RO1 style. These big R1s, research universities, you hear them more and more trying to move towards that. Yes, we do important teaching. That feels like a good trend in the conversation, but I still worry about whether the skills in terms of academic and learning benefit that our students are acquiring across the country, universities across the country, matches the kinds of things we do in classrooms.
So I had one thing that I think is very interesting is I was at the ACE conference. I was asked to moderate a panel about the future transcript. So the issue with the transcript is that actually it doesn't capture all of the educational learning experience that a student actually gets in college. So could you actually come up with something else? So the discussion really is around a competency-based transcript. So interesting principle, interesting concept. There's two places that are trying it, Southern New Hampshire University, new university that's out there, and then actually the University of Madison, Wisconsin and Extension pre-professional programs are doing it too. Very, very challenging to do. It's less actually about getting faculty to agree. It's actually a lot more about there's the issue of knowing which competencies to measure, how to measure them objectively, but what's really hard is the fact that you're going from like a credit-based model to a competency-based model. And you're actually having to try to figure out how do you compensate your faculty, but also how do you change all of your systems with respect to what the registrar does. It's like when you hear the problem, you think it's intractable. Like, why would you even start? But what I would say is this, is that I actually think competencies is a very interesting thing, and something that would be really worthwhile if any faculty are interested in having some conversations with me and some of our team about this, is that it's not about, what I believe, it's not about the competencies that employers set. So I think it is about taking what we use as learning outcomes, translating them over to competencies that actually might be helpful from a learning perspective and also from an external market perspective. And if we can actually define what they are, have rubrics to define how students are doing on them, we could do a better job of helping our students understand, here's what we're shooting for you to be able to do from a competency standpoint, in addition to learning the content of the class. That idea of the critical thinking, the communication skills, the thinking on your toes, whatever it might be, if we get those clear, it's amazing how powerful. Our students are so capable of actually articulating that if they know that that's what they're supposed to articulate. That's our biggest problem, actually. If we really think about what I feel our office is really trying to do is help students translate what they're learning in all places around their university experience and talk about it with other people. If we, faculty and staff, are actually enjoined in that whole effort, I think there's something big there. And I will say, so I was with one of the people who gives grants for the Lumina Foundation. She basically more or less said, and if you can get 4 or 5 schools to work with you on this, we will definitely fund that. Like it's so clear that they think that is sort of the direction that this has to go, something around competencies. The other piece I will say why I love this is we can figure it out. I would love to get to a place where we are able to create something that is almost like GPA optional to employers, right? So what's happened today in the employment world is people use GPA as the signal as to whether or not students actually know what they're supposed to know. And the problem with that is we've not inflated our grades. A lot of other people have. And so students don't get opportunities because some employers draw the line. So we actually have to, our whole team, we spend a lot of time trying to educate them and moderating to try to push students to them even though they don't have the right GPA for their external views. If we have competencies as a way to measure that, you might actually rather find that if every single one of our students has competencies and we actually tell the employers that, they'll look at every one of our students, not only the ones that have a 3.7. And I think that there's something there that would change the way the employers look at students that's more than just about GPA.
I'm taking a very pragmatic approach to your question and say I think the places that to think about of changes you'll see, I think some changes you'll see in the classroom. I think you may go to a model where you have the senior professor sort of like the expert surgeon who teaches certain deep portions of the classes at certain times, and surrounded this person will be a constellation of the academic equivalent of PAs, and they will be teaching more hands-on students. So I think the classroom will change. I think technology is going to change the way collaboration works. I think students more and more are going to be, in the next 10 years, compelled to figure out ways to work in teams, to work together. It's less going to be the individual academic pursuit, and it's going to be more, as I want in the workplace, a team-based approach. I think that's going to be critical. And I think the technology is going to drive so much of what we see in terms of where students work, how they work remotely, in classrooms, from home, off hours, etc. I think there are going to be big changes on the pragmatic level too.
We're ready for another question. I have some that came in on the Twitter feed. Does anyone have an in-person question? Over here.
I teach in the entrepreneurship program here at Wake Forest. My name is Jan Detter. And often I have students who are first-generation college students. And I think they have an interesting opportunity, but they also have interesting challenges at a culture like Wake Forest. Would you all like to offer some suggestions of the way in which the Academy might make more room for first-generation students to feel comfortable and respected?
I love the last word you chose, respected. And I'm here drawing on some remarkable work done at Wake by the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, because what you're, I think, talking about most centrally is helping young people who don't have many of the advantages that students whose parents and grandparents went to schools like this arrive with. I'm a first-generation college student, so I feel some of that. I'm impressed, coming back to Wake, with the level and direction and nature and comprehensiveness of our efforts to include a whole variety of students here, including first generation. We have, as I hope you know, if not, we need to talk, a specific and well-developed program that has at its center the so-called Magnolia Scholars. It's a well-funded scholarship program for first-generation students. But beginning this year, the next ring out is the First in the Forest program, which works specifically with first-generation students, including Magnolia Scholars. And there's a variety, and we're making this up as we go in many ways. Obviously, it's well-informed, and at the same time, we're piloting and testing and trialing and so on. But I've been really delighted to work with Nate French, Nancy Aguillon, Barbie, others who have made this central feature of a Wake Forest effort. So this is me being parochial again. There's a much broader conversation about first generation to be had. And it sounds as if, from your own experience, one of the next vital steps that we either need to continue or invent and make better is how to work with faculty specifically who are including these students in robust and rigorous ways in their classrooms. I think a lot of the effort has been to help the students feel at home in Wake Forest's singular distinctive culture. And I think the significant next step is to make sure that faculty have the tools and skills and experience and case studies and practices and so on that can speak to that kind of inclusion. So I'll offer that parochial response. There may be more general ones, but I feel close to and privileged to know this program as well as I do.
And I would just say two quick things on that. One is, and it's great hearing Rogan talk about what's in place here. When I was at Wake, first generation students was one of the reasons that Wake existed, especially from North Carolina. And we got some great students, and I have lifelong friends because of that, and they struggled, but they were supported. So I think it's a moral imperative for a school to be able to do that, and the schools that do that well are the ones who are going to build that base of diversity that's absolutely critical going forward. What really worries me when we talk about ratings and rankings, et cetera, and costs, the incentives for schools to either not admit these sorts of students or to not spend the money to help them succeed are pretty high, and that's very concerning.
I love the question, and I think that actually it relates to all people who come from backgrounds that in a lot of ways feel very different than the norm. And so I would say that all the work that Barbie and the Office of Diversity and Inclusion and that the LGBT Center and the Women's Center, actually, I just love what we've been able to do here. Take even what Tim Alma's doing in the chaplain's office. Like, I feel like we're just, we're in the beginning of a real interesting and really, honestly, loving community where we actually are really accepting to everyone. I think everyone has it in their heart. And I think what we don't have is the tools, and I don't think we make the time to actually make it happen. And so, like, another person who I love is Catherine Ross. Like, for those of you who are faculty, if you have the chance to actually work through her office to actually learn and get trained on how to think about some of these things, it's like so awesome. And so that's the kind of thing where I love if there's any way, if you're in the faculty or in the staff, just to sort of be thinking, how can you tap into all these great people who we have so much expertise to help us to become more culturally competent. I think that we all have, that's one of the reasons why I came to Wake Forest, is that people are so loving and compassionate and so welcoming. Like, you just know it from everyone. What we talk about is what friendliness and honor, right? We all hear that. And the thing is that we have to actually learn how to continue to do it with so many people who are different than us. And so I do think that a lot of us actually have the heart for it, and we just have to make the time for it. And we have to take the time to learn and take the time to really look and listen at individual people, because you don't realize how, you just don't realize how many people just have so many unique, interesting stories. So I just applaud, thank you for asking the question, but I think we're doing a lot to get better, but I think we have a long way to still go. But we have the resources, and so I think we should use them.
Let me take a question from the Twitter feed here. This is from, I happen to know, a recent graduate. He says, McPherson and Shapiro did a study on whether tenure-track profs are better teachers than adjuncts. Found maybe not.
You got to start that one, Mike.
Well, as a former adjunct, I think they are incredibly good. No, I mean, and on some level, I'm not sure it matters the appellation of adjunct or tenure-track professor. I think what matters is what's in the heart and mind of that teacher and their willingness and desire to connect with students and to help build that knowledge, that understanding, that wisdom. So, my assumption would be that neither group necessarily has an advantage. There's some really good adjuncts out there. There's some fabulous professors out there. And I think we sort of lose the point when we try to do the comparative between the two. And the reality is, let's hope adjuncts are really good professors, because a lot of people in this country now are getting taught by adjuncts.
I mean, that finding is much discussed, of course, and much replicated. In other words, people are studying it different ways and finding different results. But one thing that seems to shine through, at least at more elite, larger institutions, is that the tenure-track faculty are spending an awful lot of time doing research and creative work and not as much time in the classroom. So someone who's hired just to teach is likely to have a higher rating, at least in some respects. So part of what we're talking about here, along with what's in the hearts and minds of individual teachers, is the structures in the institution. And the question to ask, I think, as a college student or a parent of a prospective college student is, to what extent does that institution actually value teaching, and in what ways does that really show up? And the fact that at this institution, I would venture to say uniquely among the top 25, or maybe one of Lynn's statistics of 23 of the 25 don't care as much about this, is it is clear that tenure decisions and promotion decisions turn in significant ways on teaching. And that is not the case at most of the top 25 or 50 or whatever large research institutions, including ones I've spent time at. It just is not true. It is true here, and that is a small sort of piece of the story, but is a significant one. It matters enormously here how one performs in the classroom, whether they're tenure track or otherwise. And we also, I've also been in situations in much larger universities where if you could get a body in the classroom, you had a need to get an adjunct body in the classroom, you were just happy to keep them there over the years because they showed up and however well they performed. Wake has a unusually, in my experience, rigorous rules or ways we evaluate adjuncts, and we don't keep adjuncts that aren't doing the job in the classroom. So culture around teaching matters enormously in this question. In the U.S., we tend to sort of cede that story to liberal arts colleges, and We are obviously unusual in that we were, for many years, more or less a liberal arts college. And we are on this national university stage, but we retain that deep, abiding commitment to good teaching. I mean, I'm happy to be able to teach at Wake Forest, and one of my bosses is over there, and she sends me emails regularly about my performance. Another of my bosses asked the first question, and I had a tough sit down with her about how well I'd performed. So I can testify that no matter what position you hold, the rigor of evaluating teaching is strong.
Any other questions?
Hi, my name is Benita Brown. I am a double deacon. Yes, double deacon. I actually work as the chief of staff to the chancellor at University of North Carolina at Greensboro. I also serve as the assistant secretary to the board of trustees. As we talk about this big disruption, I'm just curious in your thoughts about the governance structures of universities. Our board of trustees are appointed by governors, the board of governors, and it's just an interesting dynamic. I have to educate new board members every year, but yet they're supposed to be making decisions and help guide the university. So I'm just curious at your thoughts about the governance structure and what that plays in this big disruption.
Oh, man, I'm going to let you.
Okay? No, it's a terrific.
You're in the middle of it, Rogan. Tell us about it.
We are muttering to one another about a good question it is. And one thing I want to just bracket at the beginning is we haven't talked much here about the differences between public institutions and private institutions. There are some significant differences. This disruption has clear, especially on the cost side, and we probably should have mentioned it in that, our set responses to that. No, the shocking diminishment of public funding, state funding, for public institutions this will be in some ways the story of this age. And so some of my sanguine responses were about private institutions, and I should have been clearer about how hard a role it is to slog. I also will say that the question of governance, particularly governing boards, is much more fraught in many cases at public institutions. I can't believe the idea that someone from outside puts on your board the people who have significant say over how the institution is shaped, if not led. I mean, boards make enormous arrays of vital decisions. They're very much in our heads here at Wake, as I'm sure you at UNCG. So I will say there's a significant difference. My answer is I've spent my career mostly in private institutions. So once again, I think my answer is a bit more sanguine. I think that close attention to and engagement with, in a educative kind of way with board members is essential. Sort of somehow assuming that because a typical board member is from a large institution, often corporate, knows how to manage and run things, they've got some good ideas for us, is not the best way to go. We are unusual institutions, and I've been impressed and in fact part of the work to educate the board members here about how it is we do our business. It's obviously a two-way flow, but there is a strong flow from us in that direction about the nature of the academic mission. In fact, part of the answer I gave about tenure is drawn from an academic committee of the Board of Trustees conversation about tenure and its value that we had this very year, just a few months ago. So I think lots of ways to come at that question. I think it's important to notice the difference between public and private. And my heart goes out to folks in public institutions who have your board members visited upon you. And the conversations I think many of us have with our friends and peers at other institutions where, here comes a whole new set of board members, many of them hostile to the institution itself and its crazy liberal leanings. We are blessed that we don't have to deal with that. We have active, engaged board members here. I think that's also important. They are attentive and interested in what takes place, but I think my sense is we're in a very good place with our board. They have been, I'll say they have been well educated about the mission and the values and the strategy and the purposes. Andy's been part of that education as well, so if I've gotten this wrong, you've been doing this longer, so speak up. But that's, I think, those two pieces are, I think, how one has to respond to that very important question. Again, my heart goes out to you.
On some level, and one of the things I don't still fully understand is how shared governance came to be, right? And the history of it, and that's something that I want to understand better. But the very fact that institutions, be they private or public, can do as well as they have with a system of shared government where things are so diffuse, with the faculty involved, with the administration, with board of trustees, whether they're handpicked or whether they're visited upon you, as Rogan says, is truly an amazing testament to the value of the vision and the mission of an institution of higher learning. I just look at shared governance, and many people we talk to who are in the midst of it say shared governance is broken, and that's one of the biggest problems in higher education. And it's going to play a big role in the disruption in terms of how nimble, how agile, how smart are institutions when it comes to dealing with these tsunamis that are hitting them.
One thing that I will say about public institutions that's very interesting is that because it's so clear that you and your budgets are so set, that your ability to think probably out of the box about generating new revenue or doing new things is so constrained that you're sort of like, you just do what you're told in a lot of ways. So you can imagine then in that case, the idea of innovation has got to be very, very difficult. And on the other hand, like I think about it, North Carolina, when you actually have a chancellor like Holden Thorpe was, where he makes innovation an agenda, he gets the governor to approve it, and then he establishes this huge board of people to create an innovation board and then starts to figure out how do we drive innovation into the university. The interesting part is that he can actually just set it up to try to have some things happen because he's got the endorsement from someone, even though the faculty may hate it. The reality is he's got that endorsement. So you actually have this one side, which is real constraint, real control, just follow the rules. But every once in a while, there's some big top-down thing that everyone just talks about like it's the greatest thing since sliced bread, right? So I can imagine at University of Florida, one of those things is you all have to actually do online. We're putting a whole big online studio here. Everyone has to do it. Even if you don't want to, you have to do it. So part of you would go, that's crazy making. Part of you would go, that's so innovative, right? But in a place like this, you actually have something where we got to find ways to bubble things up from the bottom. We actually have to get little groups of faculty working together, little groups of faculty and staff working together. Because actually if Rogan or Nathan came and said, we're doing this, most of the faculty would go, that's not me, right? And that's really fair. And so it's just very fascinating that at this one hand is that you have this ability and freedom to innovate, but you actually have to want it from the bottoms up. You can't actually say, tell us what to do, because actually once they tell you, you don't want it. So it's very interesting dynamic in a private. You actually have this sense that you could do a lot of things, but you actually have to figure out how to be very entrepreneurial within it, whereas you don't have that probably as much in the public.
One last question.
Hi. So I think it's clear that the three of you and probably everyone else in this room are supportive of the investment in a liberal arts education, but what I'm curious about is something you discussed in the beginning of this discussion. So you were saying that larger universities, large research universities, have significantly larger amounts of money, and as technology becomes more important in the world, we're not going to be able to keep up as Wake has less money. But why is it that right now, the generation that's going into college right now, it cares a lot about technology and it's extremely important. Right now, why are we not seeing the effects of that currently? Why do you say that's 20 years from now that people might not want to be coming to a school like Wake?
As opposed to right now.
Right.
So I will say that's a really good question. And my guess is that there are actually some students today who may, on the margin, not choose Wake. So we know that there's students probably at some level who say, you don't have the science facilities that actually you should have for a school that I want to go to. That might be enough. You don't have the engineering school, so that might be enough. The number who might say aren't using online education today, probably more students are less willing to say that's not the number one reason why I wouldn't come to a school. Unless actually you might think there are some students, let me use an example, like I know of some students who go to MIT, they actually take the classes that they're registered to take, and they take classes online, so they actually have double the number of credits than they normally have in a semester, right? They're that kind of person, but that's the few, right? There are not that many people in the world who can do that. So I think that the thing there is, the question is, at what point will students start to see this online sort of learning as something that they so much value that they expect to see it at the school they want to go to? And that's a really interesting question. So here's another example. I read this in the Chronicle of Higher Education. So University of Florida, there's a student who was, so she actually needed to work to put herself through school. She had a baby. So she had a choice: drive 20 minutes to school, sit in a classroom with 500 people, and then come back, but not be able to go to work and also not be able to take care of her child. So she said, I'm actually going to take care of my child, find someone to take daycare, go to work, make my money, and do the class online. And they were talking to her like, well, what's the deal? Like, are you sure that's better than going to class? And she said, you know what? In a room of 400, 500 people, this is better than going to class. I actually can see the person better. I'm actually more dialed in. I'm okay with that. But we don't have to have that problem because we don't have that kind of situation. And so people, when they come here, that's not really what they're looking for. So I think that being the case, you know, our students today, at least the ones who are interested in Wake Forest, don't seem like they're going to not choose us because we don't maybe have all of the cutting, leading, bleeding edge kind of technology. But I will say at the same time, so just so you know, is that we have groups of faculty and staff. You know, Nancy's out there in IT, Nancy Crouch, and they've got a Vision 2020 group. They're all trying to figure out, so if we were looking at 2020, what should we be doing from an IT perspective to make sure that we have the right things that are going to make the biggest difference to help our faculty be effective teachers, to help them be productive, to help our students be effective and productive, that's going to make their lives easier and better. Like, I think that's something that we're all interested in trying to figure out. But it's one thing to figure it out, and it's another thing to actually then start to spend the money, start to train the people, start to implement it. But I will tell you, one of the things that's really neat about Wake Forest is that we do a lot of things where we're trying to do things together in community. Like, you know, we actually get students or fellows to actually go and get groups of people together and try things and figure out how to invent stuff. So in some ways it can feel like we go slower, but by going slower we get more input and more advice and we come up with better ideas. So I think I like this notion. I use this phrase, it's better to go slow first, to go fast later, than it is to go fast and then find out there's no one else with you, right? I think we do a good job of that.
Let me leave my role as moderator and answer that question. Just before I came to this meeting, we had a meeting of Vision 2020 that Andy referred to. And that exact same question came up. A student said, you know, the technology in my high school was better than I find at Wake Forest. I have a feeling that there was more sophisticated online interactions going on then than I see now. And the job of that Vision 2020 committee is to figure out a way to get better at that. And we are under orders to come up with recommendations by the end of this spring in order to address some of those questions. So I very much appreciate the fact that you would voice that.
I'll just parenthetically say, when Andy said, and I echoed, that we'll get there in 20 years, it was not that we'll get to new technology in 20 years, it's that we will have an endowment, we hope, in 20 years that will enable us to try lots of experiments and lavish money on them. Wake has actually been, for some period of time, a significant leader at moments in time, at least, in technological practices. When I was a student here, way back in the 1370s, Wake had the first Mac lab in the Southeast. Provost Ed Wilson saw the future of Macs and put them in place. In 1996, as a proud alum, I looked, as the nation did, at Wake becoming the first, it's planned for the class of 2000, first university in the country to give laptops out to every entering student. That may not seem as cool to you today as it did back then, but it was a remarkable innovation at the time. And then it is true that we are not, universally wired to offer classes through MOOCs. I like Andy's point that we also don't have 500 student classrooms where you can't quite see the teacher. Less than 1% at this point, this is this year's number, or sorry, just at 1% of our classes are over 50 students for undergrads. So no, you don't need the fancy tech clicker kind of distraction, the fact that there's 250 people sitting around you in the classroom. But our approach, I think, has been, with Andy's right about this, with faculty and student and staff engagement together to try a set of pilots in the online space to see what kinds of things work. So we actually put a nationally highly ranked Masters of Counseling program, which continues to be nationally highly ranked in its in the classroom variation, online. We didn't abandoned the first. We still have our in-class one, but we're also trying an online version of that, seeing how it goes. It's, you know, a lot of money pouring out of the Provost office to help make it work, but that will turn around eventually. I mentioned the ZSRX programs earlier. This seems to me the future of MOOCs in many ways, rather than some huge undifferentiated, just try it. You figure out who your audience is and then offer a well-curated, well-platformed, and so on online version of the class. We were one of the first original 10 schools to join the Semester Online Consortium. That was a good, complicated conversation among faculty, many of whom are here in this room where the conversation took place. We're seeing how that works. And in fact, it was one of our biology department faculty members who Carol Brown described herself as a techno-skeptic who stood up and I think in many ways persuaded a lot of her fellow faculty members that this is an exciting possibility. And then, you know, in a quiet, one by one, let's see how it works ways, a number of faculty, including people in this room, are developing online variants of courses that they teach here at Wake in the classroom, just to see how it works, because we're curious about the thing. Once again, I think what you're seeing is innovating and developing adaptations in a context of mission, purpose, tradition that feels, you know, like the absolute right way to go about it. So I wouldn't feel too down on what your future alma mater is providing so far, because actually in a whole lot of ways it is at an interesting place. You know, the laptop that you're getting for free will in the next year or two be a choice of a variety of devices. That's an exciting way to go. We're piloting that right now in a couple departments. We may be the first university to offer all the software that you all are able to use on your laptops now in a virtual cloud place. You can just download what you need when you need it. We're piloting that right now. So this actually feels like an exciting space, but we are going cautiously and carefully, and it feels to me, I know there's naysayers still, but it feels to me like we're moving forward together, and that's essential. Because look up the road at a very well-endowed institution, a private institution, that rushed ahead with something like Semester Online only to find the faculty vote down the administration's decision. That's not where you ever want to be. So I'm glad you asked it. It matters a lot, and we just need to keep, I mean, one thing we need to do is keep getting the message out and the experience out to students that when you all want to experiment and try interesting new things, we're right there with you.
Mike Riley, you have the final word.
The one thing I would say to that, and it's great seeing Rogan lay out many of the things Wake has done, but I think the challenge for Wake and every other institution of higher education is figuring out how to play to your strengths, because each one of them is going to be differentiated. And when it comes to technology, using that technology to play to the strength that is of Wake Forest, and that is teaching. So technology is a tool for teaching, I think, for you guys figuring out what the future is exactly the right way to go, teaching and learning.
Please join me in thanking the panelists. It's been a great discussion.